she looked was way beyond compare. How could I dance with another? Oh, the dice on her standing there. Yeah, yeah.
What's your name?
I don't know.
What's the trouble?
They're gone.
Who's gone?
They're Beatles.
What are you going to do now?
Go home and cry.
It wasn't George Martin's bag. He wasn't interested in rock or guitar groups. George's bag was like the Goons, comedy records and stuff like that. So it was Ron Richards that turned up and was left to Ron and myself to produce Love Me Do. And it was 2 or 3 weeks later, I think, when they came in again. But before that, Ron had reported back to George Martin, saying that he thought Pete Best had got to go, that he thought his drumming wasn't good enough. I didn't agree, as I said, because it wasn't how he was playing, it was what he was playing.
When we got back in touch with George Martin after dismissal, just to try and, resolve a bit of this puzzle that was there, because we weren't getting any answers. Drumming wasn't good enough, been with the band 2 years, and there was all these adverse things getting said. So it was like, let's go to the horse's mouth. And the horse's mouth being George Martin. Brian wouldn't say anything. He was quite tight-lipped about it. Just in as much as the boys want you out, and he stood by that, right? We phoned George Martin, and George Martin explained to us, or my mother Mona actually, he basically turned around and said, it could have been misconstrued, right? He said, what I meant was to find we can use a session drummer in studio. He said, I realise, the charisma of Pete within the band, as regards the lineup, the quality he brings to the band as regards that. What happens in studio and what happens on stage is totally, different, right? Whether that got misconstrued, whether it was because of forces beyond my control, it was like, okay, let's utilise that excuse to get rid of Pete. We can turn around and say, they want to use a session drummer. And of course, the same thing happened to Ringo.
The other 3 guys, Paul, John and George, had seen Ringo and knew Ringo. Ringo came into the group, so then we started doing Love Me Do again. This time with George Martin. I think Ron was in there as well at the same time. It was a double production job. And again, Ringo's drumming did not impress. And I was dying to say, it's not how they're playing, it's what they're playing. But I thought, well, I better keep out of it, keep stum. And the next thing happened was that Ringo was taken off and a session drummer was brought in, a session drummer called Andy White, who I knew very well. I knew all the session guys. And he came in, and Andy had listened to their head arrangement, and he started playing almost exactly how I thought it should be played, funnily enough. And I thought, that's how it should be done. And of course, that's how the master was achieved, with Andy White playing drums for Love Me Do.
He didn't like it very much, no. But we didn't speak, apart from just saying hello, that's all, being introduced. Yeah, I think he talks about it still. Funny thing is, it's usually thought that George Martin booked me, but he didn't really. It was just a quirk of fate, he couldn't make that morning session, George. So he had a guy called Ron Richards, who was also a producer, and book a drummer. And I'd worked for Ron quite a lot. So he booked me, being the rock and roll drummer, you see. And that's came about. He actually did the session, Ron. And George came in towards the end of it. I didn't even know who I was going to play with. He just said, can you be at Abbey Road at 10 o'clock in the morning? Okay, bring your drums.
Of course, Andy sat in for P.S. I Love You and Love Me Do. And, you know, Please Please Me, a couple of takes on that and that. Until eventually, you know, the Beatles, somewhere in their, you know, recording history, turned around and said, enough's enough, you know, Ringo's staying on the sessions. And away you go. So, you know, whether the same thing would have happened to me or not, it's hearsay now, isn't it?
It varies from what people say about takes. We didn't do as many takes as sometimes they say, you know. It was quite good, and we got on with this stuff. We did Please Please Me, you know. Love Me Do, and P.S. I Love You. And we did a take of Please Please Me, which I think was released on the album, the first album. Although Ringo played on the single, which was the big hit of Please Please Me.
I mean, you can tell Andy White's version and Ringo's version of Love Me Do. Ringo's a little bit heavier. My version was totally different. And I think the unfair thing about people who sort of listen to my version and sort of compare it with Andy's version and Ringo's version is that mine wasn't a finished version, right? That was dropped in a couple of tracks. And that was just dropped for the edification of letting George Martin and the sound engineers know what the song was about, okay? And, you know, to let them think about it. And of course, the next time they came back, you know, they'd have a better idea as regards what the arrangement was. So, you know, when you listen to it, I listen to it, and it's like, well, yeah, it's not a finished recording. You know, it's like a glorified demo. You know, that's one way of looking at it.
What are your favourite Beatles tracks?
Love Me Do, Please Please Me.
Drumming-wise, I don't think it made a lot of difference. But there was an almighty kerfuffle outside here when they made the change.
But this boy wants you back.
The very first night that Ringo appeared here, there were dozens of girls outside here with placards saying, Pete forever, Ringo never. And George Harrison actually got a black eye from one of these girls coming into this club because of this. But eventually it all settled down, and Ringo became an integral part of the group.
Pete was a great, noisy, loud, thumping drummer. But he was never like with the other three. I mean, if you saw them out at night after a gig, at the Blue Angel or one of the late night drinking spots, Pete was never with them. He'd always gone home with the equipment and his girlfriend.
Best answer that, I think, by quoting John Lennon, because at the very beginning I asked John what the situation was with Pete Best, and John said, Pete Best is a great drummer, Ringo Starr is a great Beatle. And that was something that meant a great deal to me. I knew exactly what he meant, although I was only just getting to know the Beatles at the time. That is the point. Pete Best was fine as a musician, no problems, but somehow he wasn't a Beatle, whereas Ringo Starr fell very naturally into the role of one of the Fab Four. But of course, the Pete Best situation was very much more complicated and complex than most people realised at the time or even know now.
To this day, there are various theories as to why he got the sack.
That is the unknown question. There's so many stories, you take your pick. Lots say it was jealousy of his good looks. I tend to go along with that one, really. Because, believe me, he was as good a drummer as Ringo, if not better. He put the Merseybeat into the music of Liverpool. That was Pete Best.
I think it was a 2-year period. Okay, my time with the Beatles, this is the way I would express it. It was a 2-year period which was full of adventure, right? There was sadness because there was death, you know, with Stu's, you know, brain hemorrhage. But it was always fun because we were doing things and we were crossing boundaries and doing things that other bands weren't doing. And it was always exciting. It was always each day you look forward to it. It wasn't like waking up and going, oh God, here we go. What are we going to do today? It was like, let's wake up and let's get on with life. That was it. That's why the time passed so fast. You know, it was so exciting. There were so many things going on, different directions. You know, it was great to be part of.
I heard it. I remember hearing it, going to watch a football match at Liverpool one my way, and in those days there was no local radio. There was usually used to be Radio Luxembourg or something, and I always used to carry a transistor to get the football results. And the Beatles came on actually, and I thought, great, you know, we've heard them live, now they've made a record, it was Love Me Do.
Let's be honest, EMI did not do a good promotional job on the Beatles in the beginning at all. They picked up rather late on the Beatles' success and didn't see their potential at all. I mean, I have it on first-hand authority from somebody who was in the actual meeting that at a meeting of all these sort of promotional people and everything, EMI tended to have this each week before each week's releases were discussed, and it was decided what kind of priority they would have for promotion purposes. And at the appropriate meeting when Love Me Do, the first single, came up, the head of promotion virtually sort of embarrassed George Martin by sort of saying, you know, George, what are you doing? This is rubbish. You're never going to get anywhere with this. So knowing that, it wasn't very surprising to find out that EMI had downgraded. I mean, they had different levels of promotional activity, as it were, and the Beatles were at the very bottom of that week's pile to get perhaps one sponsored play on Radio Luxembourg or whatever it was, and no more.
But I've spoken to quite a few people who were around at the time who remember hearing it and going, oh, the Beatles, they're an R&B band, and being quite shocked by how raucous and sort of rough it sounded compared to the other things that were coming out of England at that time. Now, it's very hard to imagine that in the wake of what came afterwards when you hear what the Stones did a year later. But it's interesting that, as I say, people in '62 thought that this was quite a sort of rough and uncompromising piece of work.
Love Me Do is pretty unusual in terms of Beatle tracks, because what you always remember is the harmonica lick, which I think was nicked from Bruce Chanel's Hey Baby, if I'm not mistaken.
It lays heavily on the second and the fourth beat in the bar, ba, da, da, which gives the whole thing the groove.
And it immediately diffuses all that kind of sugary sweetness that McCartney was addicted to.
There was something so basic and simple and honest about this wonderful sound, Love Me Do, blasting from the jukebox, compared to, say, all the Tin Pan Alley songs that you were used to hearing, or even the old-style rock and roll tunes.
I mean, if you go back to where this sort of style begins with rock and roll in the mid-50s, then it was the energy and the crudeness of that was absolutely crucial in the whole style catching on. But by 1962, we'd lost that. So in a sense, there was a rediscovery of that sort of crudeness.
And what John did on that song, and on many songs over the career of the Beatles, is he would take the low harmony. And that was really something that isn't done very often then or even now. But that intrigued me, and it made the song have a very warm, different tonal sound to it than you normally hear in a pop song.
with a verse, you'd normally expect a length of, well, a regular length of something like 8, 12 or 16 bars. What we get here is 10. There's a phrase which they begin with, which is repeated twice. Now that's not unusual, but then is repeated a third time. Now that is unusual. And then we go into the end of the verse.
Well, Love Me Do, the very first single, that was very influenced by Hey Baby, the Bruce Chanel hit, particularly the harmonica passages by Delbert McClintock. And in fact, the Beatles appeared with Bruce Chanel at the Tower Ballroom in New Brighton. And John went up to them, and Delbert spent 15 minutes showing him how to do the harmonica solo, which he did on Love Me Do. So that is the big influence. If you hear both records, you hear this harmonica thing.
It's really hard to kind of pin down the Beatles' oeuvre, if you like, because they got so many different styles. It's like they couldn't settle on anything. You listen to their whole output, and they're always trying new things. But, you know, as story writers probably admit, there's nothing new under the sun. It's just a kind of an ear for, delightful cross melodies and things like that. You know, you could say, I mean, like Duke Ellington says, there's two kinds of music, good and bad, But there's more, because there's fast and slow. But I really couldn't put my finger on it, other than they're all cracking musicians. And George is no slouch on chords, and Paul's talent for doing that, and John's kind of incisive thing on the lyric thing, and also very much a soul voice, and writing songs from his view of the world. Put that together with Ringo's, solid, stuff, and you've got an absolute winning combination.
I first met the Beatles rather belatedly, actually, at a time when Brian Epstein had asked me to be their PR. He'd said, leave Decca, join me at NEMS Enterprises, open the new London office, in fact, for me, and let's go from there. I'm going to have a lot of other artists as well, and I think he named Jerry and the Pacemakers and named Cilla Black, and said all these artists will be coming along soon. I'll need to open a press office in London for them. Will you come and head that up? So it was arranged that there would be a meeting at this little pub off Manchester Square, a place that's still there to this day, and we were all going to meet up over a casual drink, and Brian figured quite rightly that this was a good occasion for them to get to meet me, get to know me, and for each of us to decide whether we could work with one another happily or not. Well, the first words that I got from John Lennon that night were, if you're not queer and you're not Jewish, what are you coming to work for Brian Epstein for? I realised as time went by that this was a sort of fairly mild, it sounded at the time an eye-popping remark to make, especially to somebody who you didn't know. But this was mild stuff for John Lennon, I mean, who came out with a lot of acid remarks, caustic remarks, cruel remarks, and a lot of very funny ones too. Throughout that evening at this pub, the role of host for the evening was immediately assumed and played very, very well by Paul McCartney. And my first lingering memory of him is how he went round us all, round the rest of the group, round myself and my wife and indeed Brian Epstein, the roadies and everybody, and asked them what they wanted to drink. And then said, right, it's doubles all round, eh, lads? And off he went to the bar and he ordered up all these drinks. And when the guy behind the bar eventually gave him the price of £2.14 and threepence or whatever it was, only then did Paul go, Brian! So although the genial host Paul McCartney had been seen to host the occasion and buy a round in, It was Brian Epstein who actually paid for it, picked up the tab.
There's only two artists I've ever worked with for more than one night stand, as it were. That's Paul McCartney and Yoko Ono. I think that's a pretty damn good choice, because in the history of the Beatles, Paul met me the first day I did Bebopaloola live on stage, okay? And a mutual friend brought him to see my group called the Quarrymen. And we met and we talked after the show, and I saw he had talent, and he was playing guitar backstage and doing 20 Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran. And I turned around to him right then on first meeting and said, "Do you want to join the group?" And he said, And I think he said yes the next day, as I recall it. Now, George came through Paul, and Ringo came through George, although, of course, I had a say in where they came from, but the person I actually picked as my partner, who I recognized had talent and I could get on with, was Paul. Now, 12, well, however many years later, I met Yoko. I had the same feeling. It was a different field, but I had the same feeling.
The Beatles proved that you could have a self-contained songwriting team within a group. I mean, originally, when they'd made their breakthrough with Love Me Do, their producer, George Martin, wanted to foist a song from Denmark Street, which is sort of Britain's Tin Pan Alley, onto them, called How Do You Do It? But they made such a pig's ear of it that he said, well, what else can we do? And they sort of came up with Please Please Me, which impressed him immensely. And I mean, as soon as they'd actually finished recording, he said, "Gentlemen, you've made your first #1 record."
Last night I said these words to my girl. I know you never even try, girl. Come on, come on.
Please Please Me, the Beatles song, was quite unusual and quite different from a lot of the recordings of that era, because George Harrison's role in the band was lead guitar, but not, as we know, as a rock god lead guitarist. You know, he was a supporting role to the vocals. And on that particular song, what they did was they doubled the vocals with the lead guitar, which is quite unusual. So that there, he was doubling the vocals that Lennon and McCartney were singing.
Please Please Me, the second Beatles single, the first #1.
It's actually an amazing piece of songwriting, I think, for the time. It's got elements of Roy Orbison about it and elements of some of the sort of early 60s R&B. But it's the first real Lennon-McCartney song that's got that sort of indefinable something that is magic.
They were thinking of it as more of a Roy Orbison type of a ballady type song. George Martin decided that no, we should speed it up a little bit, you know, and give it a bit more of a faster pace. And I think that was the success of that song, is the fact that you know, Martin could see something more in that song than when the Beatles first brought it to him.
Now that really is quite climactic, and it works extremely well. Very, very simple.
It's a very overtly sexual invitation from Lennon. You know, they're sort of the way that when it gets to the chorus, it's come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, please, please me. So he was being quite kind of, you know, tongue-in-cheek about it, but on later sort of examination, you can clearly see it's sort of it's talking about sort of basically, you know, this sort of fairly horny young dude.
Come on, come on, come on, come on, please, 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 oh yeah, I got
This doesn't sound at first listening like a particularly interesting song. And I think the reason it works is probably two rather subtle features, neither of which are common, certainly in, what were we calling it then? Beat music at the time, or popular music wider, perhaps. One is the sort of refrain at the end of the verse, where you have what we would call contrary motion between the voice and the bass. In other words, they work against each other. Frequently, with a lot of unschooled musicians, melody and bass often tends to work in parallel. So when one goes up and down, the bass goes in the same direction. And it's normally regarded as an indication of schooling or of expertise, actually, to make them work in the opposite direction.
please, 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 oh yeah, I got please, please, oh yeah, I got please, please, oh yeah, I got
It's rather like when you hear a choir, a church choir, you get that feeling of warmth and contentment coming from it. And also, I think this is part of the Beatles' secret, really, is that they seem to be singing directly to you.
Well, the Please Please Me album was their first album as such. And I say to people, if you want to have a feeling of what the Beatles were like at the Cavern Club, listen to this album. Okay, it's not the most professional. It was put together, as we know, in record time. You know, it's just unbelievable, you know, what they did with this. And today, the mind boggles, you know.
There's 3 sessions, 10 to 1, 2 to 5, 7 to 10. In one day, 13 tracks.
We used to treat records as newspapers. You finished recording them on the Friday and they were in the shops the following Friday.
Remember that at this period, albums were basically there to resell the single to people who'd already got it and to put in some padding just to make it album length. And something like Please Please Me begins to feel as if it belongs, all those tracks belong together.
10 of the tracks were done in one day, one 15-hour day. I mean, to stereo, it's like amazing that, you know, that they arrived at such quality.
And the Beatles, they did it all live, and they were just so young and really inexperienced, and they just fell right into it. They were made to do what they did.
In 1963, nobody particularly cared about albums. It was a very small market, mostly aimed at adults who could afford these very expensive records. I mean, as far as kids were concerned, they used to have to save up to buy a single, never mind an album. So really it was just a way for the record company to make a bit of extra money, and for the performers as well. So there was no great thought that went into it whatsoever. It really was just a question of getting as many songs onto tape as quickly as possible and getting another record into the shops to capitalise on the success of the single. So in that context, it's not a bad record. I mean, you consider it was all pretty much made in one day, but it sounds very amateurish, I think, compared to what was soon to follow.
Until the Beatles came along, the album chart was more or less the preserve of West End musical soundtracks, Hollywood soundtracks, balladeers, crooners, So while we look back at the albums now, and it's hard to judge what their impact was, I think certainly running through the 60s, the albums became more important because the Beatles were important.
A really wise choice by George Martin and EMI to not to put the sort of onus on the Beatles to come up with a whole album's worth of material, because I don't think they would have come up with as good an album.
It was intended to present the Beatles, being it was their first album, as a kind of a live feel as to what they were doing in their live shows.
It doesn't matter whether the song is an original that they've written at the instruments, or whether it's one that they simply like the vocal of, or they like the harmonic pattern of. They do it in exactly the same way, and it's that sort of commonality which blurs the distance between the original stuff and the covers. So you come to something like Twist and Shout, and because you're used to the way that the Beatles approach it, if you didn't know the Isley Brothers original, it's a Beatles track.
The last track was going to be Twist and Shout, which John Lennon was going to sing. Well, by that time, his voice was pretty shattered the whole day, you know. And the funny thing was that on the grand piano, the chapel piano down in number 2, which was shut, of course, I didn't use that, was a big, do you remember those jar, you probably don't, but a big jar of confectionery jars that they had. That was filled with hacks, the throat sweets, that was full with that. But funnily enough, by the side of it was 2 cartons of Peter Stuyvesant cigarettes, which of course they did smoke as well, quite a few during the day. So I don't know what was, you know, whether the hacks were there to cancel out the result of smoking or the result of singing so much during the day. Anyway, we came to do Twist and Shout, and you know, he could barely talk properly, and so I thought, well, I've got to get this in one take. So I better not, you know, mess things up. So anyway, we did. We got it in one take, because I don't think he could have done take 2.
And in my opinion, it's one of John Lennon's finest vocals of the actual record. Done with a terrible sore throat. He had a cold. They'd already recorded something like 10 or 12 songs that day. He had one last vocal left in him, and that was it. On stage, it was the great rabble-rouser. It was an enormous climax in lots of ways. I think for the audience, it was the one that got the girls really, really excited. The Beatles jerked around on stage as they performed it in a very convulsive kind of manner, and it brought all sorts of illicit longings to the loins of their fans, I think.
Well, shake it up, baby. Shake it up, baby. Twist and shout. Twist and shout. Come on, baby. Come on, baby. Come on and work it on out. Work it on out. Work it on out. You know you look so good.
It's hard when you're a big fan of somebody to copy their work, because you never imagine you can do a good as job as what they did. And I think the Beatles surpassed it easily. Isley Brothers do an awesome song, but really the Beatles version, there is something about the energy and the fact that it opened all their shows when they played in North America.
Definitive version in many ways, especially with John Lennon's screaming vocals and Ringo's powerful explosions at the end when he finishes it with a couple of powerful snare drum beats. It's still a great performance of that kind of soul anthem.
Shake it up, baby. Twist and shout. Twist and shout. Come on, come on, come on, baby. Now. Come on, baby. Come on and work it on. Work it on now. Twist it up, girl. You know you twist so fine.
Ringo said about himself that he can't play a drum solo to save his life. But what he is, though, he's a great timekeeper. And if you listen to some of the outtakes that have been released through the years where there's breakdowns, it's never Ringo's fault.
What you needed was a solid backbeat He could certainly do that. A rock and roll feel, and also a kind of quirkiness to his playing. So you get all these unexpected little drum fills.
I've heard it said that Ringo is a left-handed person playing right-handed drums, and if that's actually true, I'm not a drummer myself, but if it's actually true, it could explain why he had his own little vocabulary on the drums, why he'd do certain patterns.
I don't think anybody took Ringo Starr seriously in the 60s, except other musicians. Other drummers would always say, Ringo's great, he's the best at just keeping a beat. He was the least flashy drummer in rock music. He was very embarrassed about ever having to do solos. He didn't like that idea. He thought the whole point of the drummer was to be at the heartbeat of the band.
Everybody adored Ringo. Fans, mothers, grandparents, children. Ringo encompassed across the board. Paul might have been one section's favourite, George might have been the other section's, John might have been, but everybody loved Ringo. It wasn't like... Ringo wasn't probably not anybody's favourite, but everybody adored him. Everyone had a favourite, but they all loved Ringo. Because he was just Ringo.
Okay, well, Lennon and McCartney came up with the lyrics and the melodies and the harmonies by and large. But they wouldn't be the songs we know were it not for the drum track that you've actually got there. So his contribution as a performer is put on one side as a performer's contribution.
A journalist asks John Lennon, is Ringo the best drummer in the world? And John Lennon looks at him and says, mate, Ringo isn't even the best drummer in the Beatles, because Paul McCartney used to play drums quite well, and McCartney was always on Ringo's sort of ass about about styles of playing, which really hurt Ringo and sort of made him kind of feel vulnerable. His position was, he felt was vulnerable in the band throughout.
If you put another drummer in the Beatles, would they be as good? No. Would they be the Beatles? No. Ringo is a Beatle.
He's an important element of them becoming as successful as they became.
And the Americans loved Ringo. I mean, he was the most popular Beatle. And they had like campaigns, Ringo for President. Most of the novelty songs that came out in '64 and '65 were about Ringo. One of them was that, you won't go far without a guitar unless you're Ringo Starr. That was a great title for a song.
Maybe we can start another controversy here. One of your countrymen was here yesterday or the day before he returned to England, or on his arrival in England. He said he thought American women were out of style for not wearing miniskirts, and that because they didn't wear miniskirts, their legs were ugly. I'd like to ask you what you think about American women's legs.
Well, if they don't wear miniskirts, how does he know their legs are ugly?
From Me to You has the familiar Lennon and McCartney credit. And in those days, Lennon and McCartney actually did write the songs together.
They were on the road touring extensively, and so the half an hour here and 20 minutes in this hotel room and 3 hours before this show, John and Paul were sitting down and writing some of these songs that would cement the Beatles' musical sound.
I got arms that long to hold you and keep you by my side. I got lips that long to kiss you and keep you satisfied.
And most songs are 2 verses, then a chorus, and then a solo, and then it's repeated. But they go right into the chorus right off the bat, and then go into a verse. And it brings some excitement to the beginning of a tune where you kind of go, whoa, what's that?
And it's got the trademark in the middle of it from the Beatles, which they were well known for. And if you look at the construction of it, it's a very cleverly constructed little pop song.
8-bar verse, followed by another 8-bar verse, followed by an 8-bar middle 8, let's call it, and then another 8-bar verse. So you've got a standard AA/BA 32-bar form, which is not a key element of rock and roll as they would have inherited it, but it comes from the sort of Tin Pan Alley tradition.
They'd sort of gone and looked into jazz standards, classical music and looked at how material was constructed. And they've come up with, you know, From Me to You, and it became a winning formula, and they employed it sort of countless times later as well.
They're beginning to get a formula, but it's the middle eights and the verses and the changes from the verses to the chorus that give them the keys, and the harmonies between John and Paul, which make it very clever.
Construction is all important, really. It's just the sort of interplay between the voices, and the message of the song is like From Me to You. What a wonderful way to establish a relationship, really.
There was only one song that I was a bit iffy about when I told you that I used to record them singing live when I didn't have the 4-track. And so to do that, I had the vocal mic on a figure of eight configuration with the dead side looking at the group, a microphone I'm talking about. And in front of that, I would use a music stand where they would put their lyrics, handwritten lyrics, to both Paul and John could glance down and refresh their memory with the lyric. I set them up on this particular session, and I went down later to check that all the mics were in position, and by this time they had put a lyric on the music stand. So I thought, oh, it'd be interesting, go and have a look. And I went and had a look, handwritten, and it said, "She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. She loves you, yeah, 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 yeah." And I thought to myself, Christ, this is going to be a funny sort of song. And up to that time, of course, every song had magic, you know. I thought, be interesting to see this one. It's not going to be a Beatles song. Anyway, once they started singing it, of course, I mean, it all came to life. Wonderful. But to go back to what I was saying, there was no song, but in answer to the many questions that have been asked me, what was my favourite, they all were.
You think you've lost your love? When I saw her yesterday, it's you she's thinking of, and she told me what to say. She said she loves you, and you know that can't be bad. Yes, she loves you, and you know you should be glad.
If you listen back to She Loves You now, it does sound a very banal, sort of crass bit of work. But if you can manage to transport yourself back to 1963, it is the song of Beatlemania. It's so simple. It's got one or two nice little twists. There's an extra new chord they'd learnt, which they put at the very end of the song, and so on. But it's just so simple and so impossibly catchy, and it just seems to sum up all the madness of 1963. It was always the song that adults talked about. If they were trying to make a reference to the Beatles, they'd always say, "Oh, the Beatles, yeah, yeah, yeah." Just a chorus that once you'd heard, you could never ever forget.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, I mean, not brilliant lyrics to say the least, but certainly very historical, and it just shows you how simple that rock and roll could be.
And it was a massive hit. I mean, massive. It went in there and stuck for weeks, and you know, they were selling 100,000 a day, for Christ's sake. You know, it was unbelievable.
I mean, it just had all the ingredients of a great pop song. Great strong melody, great hook. That's the thing they knew about, you know, they knew how to get the hook of the song across, the chorus of the song across.
What's great about the track overall, my favourite aspect of the track is the Ringo's drumming. I think it's really like superb, and you know, Ringo doesn't really get the accolade he actually deserves, I think.
What you've actually got there is what will become, 10 years later, the verse, pre-chorus, chorus of mainstream pop and heavy metal. So if we threw away She Loves You, we'd lose the whole next 50 years of development, really.
I'm credited with having invented this phrase, the Fab Four, and yes, it came about through me using a longer version of that, the Fabulous Foursome, in an early album sleeve note that I wrote for one of the Beatles records. And I was then writing a press release shortly afterwards and looking at this album sleeve, and I thought, oh yeah, I'll use that again, Fabulous Force. And then I thought, no, that sounds a bit pompous, a bit highfalutin. The Fab Four, that'll do. And you know, to my amazement, it caught on. The media used it. The media immediately used it as often as they were using the word Beatlemania, and both the things have lived on till this day. Everybody still today talks about the Fab Four.
As far as the press were concerned, Beatlemania began towards the end of '63 when they played the London Palladium, and there were lots of fans outside and screaming, and there was a TV camera, and it was on the front of, I think, the Daily Mirror the next day, Beatlemania.
The phrase Beatlemania was first coined in autumn of 1963 when the Beatles headlined a programme on ITV called Sunday Night at the London Palladium, which was the very pinnacle of orthodox British show business, you know, with its sort of dancing troupes and jugglers and its sort of beat the clock interlude, all that sort of thing. And at that time, I mean, I think that the British public needed a break from very serious news. There'd been a lot going on. There'd been the Profumo scandal, the great train robbery. That's the usual sort of East-West, black-white tensions, and the West Indies had beaten us at cricket. And what we wanted was something a bit sort of jovial, you know, something a bit safe. And there it was.
So the journalists, photographers in particular, would always be there hoping to get some interesting pictures, informal rehearsal type pictures. And that day they were there in force as usual and heard and saw this big crowd of kids outside the Palladium. Were taken as much by surprise as everybody else that this huge fan gathering had descended upon Argyle Street, and went out there and photographed the first scenes of Beatlemania.
The Beatles actually may reach impinged upon the British public at large at a time when the sort of die-hard fans were wondering if their latest single was they got into a rut, what with From Me to You sounding a bit too much like Please Please Me. And then, you know, they came up with this, you know, She Loves You, yeah, 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 and it was everywhere. Every time you turned on the radio, you know, it was there. The milkman whistled it. Even the birds in the trees whistled it. You know, suddenly the Beatles were everywhere. And it was that kind of happy-go-lucky sort of image of innocent scamps or, you know, poor honest northern lads who bettered themselves and had made it to the London Palladium. And as a result, on the 13th of October 1963, virtually the whole nation, within sort of earshot of a television, was glued to Sunday Night at the London Palladium when it came on after the God slot, you know, all the religious programmes that preceded it. And that was really, I think, what sold them to the nation. And the day after, somebody called Vincent Melcrone, journalist of the Sunday Mirror, or the Daily Mirror, was under the editorial lash to write about the Beatles' appearance on Sunday Night at the London Palladium and its aftermath. And the aftermath, you know, was police cordons, helmets rolling in the gutter, and their limousine being chased up into Oxford Street. And he came up with the phrase Beatlemania, and it stuck.
Anybody who'd been following the Beatles around the country knew that all those scenes had been happening for 6-9 months before that, and that really Beatlemania had begun when Please Please Me was out at the start of '63. But it was, I suppose Beatlemania was a public image thing, and the image says that it began at the end of '63.
Now, yesterday and today, our theater's been jammed with newspapermen and hundreds of photographers from all over the nation, and these veterans agree with me that the city never has witnessed the excitement stirred by these youngsters from Liverpool who call themselves the Beatles. Now, tonight, you're going to twice be entertained by them. Right now, and again in the second half of our show. Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles!
One of the great myths about 60s pop is that nothing was happening in America and the Beatles came along and revolutionised everything. It's just not true. The two biggest groups in America in '63, '64 were the Beach Boys and the Four Seasons, and they were pushing each other all the time to do more and more innovative songs and innovative records. Meanwhile, you've got Phil Spector making some of the greatest records of all time. And there were some wonderful country things coming out of Nashville. Soul music was kicking off. You've got Sam Cooke, Otis Redding just starting out, Ray Charles in his prime. It was anything but a desert. But what the Beatles did was bring an entirely new sort of atmosphere of freshness and Englishness, which hadn't been seen on the American pop scene before.
It was almost as if, you know, that they were saying that we do not have to accept second-rate status to the Americans anymore. You know, we're not imitating the Americans, we are us. And all the wheels of the universe came together at the same time. They had the right image, the right people in them, the right producer, the right record company, the right manager. They were fully mobilised by the time they hit the States in 1964.